Aristotle, Virtue, Well-being, and the Just Society. Sandel gives the case of Callie Smart, who at the time had been a high school cheerleader but confined to a wheelchair due to cerebral palsy. On the one hand, by all accounts, Callie's infectious enthusiasm was unequaled in the squad. What she could not do is even approach the athleticism displayed by her teammates, and for this some parents objected. This raises the question, is cheerleading essentially a means for rousing the team and fans, or at its core, is it a sport? Put another way, what is cheerleading for? Sandel then moves on to the case of Oscar Pistorius, the Blade Runner. But since then, a far more divisive case has come up, that of trans athletes. Caster Semenya is a South African track star whose birth certificate states that she is a female and from all appearances is female, but is in fact male. This is a case of differences in sex development. In 2023, the international body governing track and field banned transgendered athletes, but made an exception for people such as Castor with sex development difference, provided that they took hormone reduction treatments. Here the question is, what is the essence of athleticism? More broadly, Sandel asks whether we can really determine what is fair unless we first agree on what something is for. But as we will see here and elsewhere, to answer in the affirmative would be to overturn the last 400 years of ethical theory. But such questions fit perfectly well with what came before. The fountainhead of this sort of thinking is found in Aristotle. Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BCE. That puts it well between the events described in the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah on one hand, and the events chronicled in 1st Maccabees. He was a Macedonian by birth, studied in Athens under Plato, and despite being the smartest guy in the room, was not elected to succeed Plato at the academy. So Aristotle started his own. Virtue ethics develops along two questions. What is a certain good for, and what characteristics, that is, virtues, need to be developed in order to secure such goods? As Sandel will later put it, the good is prior to the fair. Moreover, virtue ethics presumes that if one develops good character, one will do the right thing, rather than thinking that the right thing can be derived from principle. Virtue ethics had been the dominant approach to ethics until the 17th century, and is now enjoying something of a revival. You can see this approach in Plato, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Apostle Paul, and, arguably, the Buddha. So why has virtue ethics been so closely associated with Aristotle? It's almost entirely because Aristotle was the first who articulated the approach in such detail. Virtue ethics can be difficult to get one's head around because it makes some prior assumptions that are not commonly held as they once were. Say you are watching a nature program where a pride of lions is running down an antelope. We don't think of the lions as being cruel, evil, or bad, but rather morally neutral. We don't make moral judgments because we think of ideas of good and bad as being things that we impose upon our environment. So Either there isn't anything like goodness in the natural world, or it really isn't the same thing as moral goodness. Aristotle would have agreed that the lions are not evil, but not because good and evil don't apply, but because the lions were good. Goodness in this case is more like fitness or suitability. Much like a hammer is good if it is well made and is being used for the job for which it was intended. Moral goodness would be another sort of good, but it would still apply to something being fit, suitable, or appropriate within a particular context. That brings us to the next point. We tend to describe things by what they are made of, but not so much about what they are for. Again, today, what things are for is seen strictly in light of what they are for us. This was not so for Aristotle and other ancient thinkers. How a thing functioned, what a thing was for, was an integral part of describing what something is. That brings us to the third assumption, one that we make, but Aristotle would not. If you will recall, Hume's guillotine stated that one cannot derive an ought from an is. This would have left Aristotle puzzled. He would have pointed out that we talk about ought, should, and supposed to of things that are not specifically of moral concern. If I hold a ball in midair and then let it go, and it simply hangs in the air, it is not unreasonable to state that the ball should have fallen back to earth. Should, ought, and supposed to all express expectations. Moral expectations are simply a very specific sort of expectation. Let us say that we have enough flutes in this class for each person to have one. The flutes are of various qualities. Some are your basic student flutes, serviceable but indifferent. Others are made of silver, and one of gold. So who gets the golden flute? The first question Aristotle would ask would not be who should get the best flute, but rather, what is the purpose of a flute? Aristotle's answer is that flutes are for playing. The better the flute, the more suitable it is for playing. Notice how this is different from the utilitarian, who might come to the same conclusion, but for a very different reason. The utilitarian would suggest that the best flutes should go to those whose playing provides the most pleasure. By contrast, Aristotle would argue that the best flutes should go to those who are best able to fulfill the flute's purpose. Then, to generalize in terms of justice, the best way to distribute goods, that is, those things that we value, such as wealth, honor, power, and position, should be to those who are best able to use those goods to the ends for which they were designed. The $10 word for this is teleological. That is, describing the purpose of a thing. Human beings are social creatures. The purpose of a society is to encourage the development of character that promotes eudaimonia, both of the individual and the society. Eudaimonia is an ancient Greek word which roughly translates as happiness, well-being, or human flourishing. Those who best exemplify the characteristics that promote the well-being of a society deserve the greatest honors within that society. And what might those ends be? As we've noted a couple of weeks back, justice is both a character trait of individuals and of a society. What characterizes a just society for Aristotle? Like flutes, one must step back and ask what a society is for. According to Aristotle, it must be more than just mutual protection, welfare, and commerce. A society, or to use Aristotle's word, polis, must have a uniquely human purpose to distinguish itself from, say, a herd of goats or a colony of ants. This quality in humans is what we are is rational. That is to say, we have the ability to abstract ideas from the world around us and to communicate those ideas, whether it be in art, literature, science, religion, or philosophy. This is done within a society. In fact, human beings cannot fulfill their potential for rationality without the polis. Consequently, the purpose of society is in the development of those characteristics in human beings that distinguish us from other animals. Now, let's take this a step further. Who deserves positions of power and honor? The answer again is those who are best able to lead a society, a polis, that instills virtues in its citizens. Those who have worked to develop good character deserve the honors given them. This is the idea of moral desert. According to Sandel, Rawls' theory fails because it does not ask this prior question. Rawls is most explicit on this point. For Rawls, asking what the purpose of something is prior to asking whether it is fair is an invitation to curtail liberty. Rawls dismisses teleological thinking and moral desert from the outset. According to Rawls, the fair is prior to the good. The problem is that without asking the question of the purpose first, the fairness of distribution cannot be adjudicated because fairness in itself cannot evaluate the merit of desperate goods. For instance, what is greater, the value of rousing a team or fans, or the technical and athletic ability that stands behind it? It is only until these questions are answered or asked and answered that we can then go to the question of distribution. Part of the class discussion will revolve around two questions. The first is, what are some of the difficulties in determining what something is for? The second involves some of Aristotle's specific views. For instance, Aristotle maintained that women were unfit by nature to take part in the maintenance of the polis, and that slaves were endowed to serve, not lead or participate in the finer aspects of human nature. Is it that Aristotle was simply wrong about the facts? Or does this reflect a basic flaw in his ethics?